Remember that picture of American soldiers raising that flag at Iwo Jima? It's it's like a symbol of like America, beating fascism in World War II.
Mm.
But what if I told you that like underneath that picture, like under the surface of America being united was a shocking truth.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people in the US were pro-Nazi, like when the war was starting.
Yeah. It might sound unbelievable now, but Rachel Maddow, in her podcast and book Ultra and Prequel, she goes into this part of American history that a lot of people forget about. She talks about a nation like on edge, dealing with the Great Depression and like another world war might be starting. And with all that uncertainty and fear, the Nazis, with their ideas of like strength and order, actually got a lot of followers right here in America.
Okay, so we're talking like the 1930s and 40s here, a time when like most Americans eventually wanted to fight the fascists.
Yeah.
How many people were pro-Nazi though?
More than you might think. Maddow says that like 80% of Americans at first wanted to stay out of the war. And like a lot of them actually liked Hitler. They thought he was a strong leader who had like fixed Germany.
So it wasn't just like a small group of extremists.
No, not at all. Like you saw this in a lot of different parts of society. And the Nazis were really good at propaganda. They had a whole machine operating in the U.S. They spent millions of dollars on it. They used groups that seemed harmless to spread their message.
Like a Nazi propaganda machine right here in America. What was that like?
Think about it. Newspapers, magazines, radio shows, even like rallies and youth camps. All of them saying stuff that was pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and isolationist. And the stuff was made to like really connect with Americans who weren't happy with the government or who were struggling with money or people who didn't like immigrants and minorities.
And did these groups actually change what people thought?
Yeah, sadly, they were able to like use people's anxieties and fears. They made it seem like the Nazis were the ones bringing order and stability to a world that seemed like it was falling apart.
So they were messing with people's emotions, like taking advantage of them. But you mentioned anti-Semitism. How big a part of this pro-Nazi thing was that?
It was a big part. Sadly, the Nazis and the Americans who supported them, they often said bad things about Jewish people. They blamed them for like the country's economic problems and stuff. Like they said Jewish people controlled the media, the banks, the government, all these old conspiracy theories and prejudices.
It's scary how easily hate can spread, especially when people are scared and unsure about stuff. But what's even crazier is that some of this propaganda was spread with the help of American politicians. Tell me about those members of Congress who were getting paid by the Nazis.
This is like one of the most shocking things Maddow found. She found proof that like 24 members of Congress were getting money from the Nazis to spread pro-Nazi stuff.
24. Wow. What were they thinking?
Maddow says it's complicated. Some of them probably really believed in the Nazis, while others might have just been greedy or saw a chance to get ahead in politics.
So like a mix of true believers and people just looking out for themselves. And they were all willing to betray their country for money or for their beliefs. But how did they spread all this propaganda so well?
They used their franking privileges.
Franking privileges? What's that?
It means they got to send mail for free. Members of Congress can mail stuff to their constituents without paying for stamps. And these guys use that to mail out millions of pieces of pro-Nazi stuff. And it was all paid for by taxpayers.
So they were using our money to spread Nazi propaganda? That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a crazy abuse of power. And it shows how sneaky this whole thing was. These weren't just random people fighting in the shadows. They were elected officials using the government itself to push the Nazi agenda.
This is getting really disturbing.
Yeah.
We have this big propaganda machine, politicians getting paid by the Nazis, and the public, at least at first, was buying into it. It's hard to believe this was happening right here in America.
Yeah, it's a dark part of our history, one that people don't talk about much. But it's a story that needs to be told, especially now when we're seeing all this extremism and people trying to manipulate what others think.
It's definitely a warning. But were there any good guys in all of this?
Yeah.
Like anyone who saw what was happening and tried to stop it?
Yeah, there were. In fact, Maddow talks about some heroes who stood up to the Nazis. They risked their lives to tell the truth and to protect American democracy from the inside.
Tell me more about these heroes. Who were they and what did they do?
One of the most interesting guys is Leon Lewis. He was a World War I veteran from Los Angeles. He was really bothered by how many pro-Nazi groups there were, like the German-American Bund. They were holding rallies and even running camps for kids.
So he saw the danger firsthand.
He did, and he decided to do something about it. Lewis basically started his own spy operation. He got other veterans, a lot of them were German-American, to join these pro-Nazi groups and get information.
A spy operation. In America,
Yeah.
that's wild.
It is. And Lewis's network found some scary stuff. They found out that some of these groups weren't just spreading propaganda, they were collecting stolen U.S. military weapons.
Stolen weapons. Were they planning to attack someone? What did Lewis do?
He tried to tell the authorities, but at first they didn't believe him. The FBI back then was more worried about communists. They thought these pro-Nazi groups were against communists, so they aren't a big threat.
So they ignored him.
Yeah, at first. But Lewis kept at it. And eventually people started taking him more seriously, especially when stuff like explosions started happening at places that made weapons in the U.S.
So he was way ahead of his time. He saw the danger before anyone else. What an amazing guy. Were there any other unsung heroes who helped expose this pro-Nazi movement?
Yeah, there was another guy named Henry Hoke. He was a direct mail expert, and he used his skills to show how big the Nazi propaganda operation really was.
A direct mail expert fighting Nazis. That's different. How did he do it?
Well, back then, direct mail was like social media. Hoke could track where the propaganda was going, and he saw connections between different groups. He found out that a lot of them were getting money and orders from the same places. It was a big coordinated campaign to change what Americans thought.
So he used his knowledge of advertising to expose the Nazis.
Exactly. He could see patterns that other people missed. He showed just how big the Nazi influence operation was.
These heroes are changing my view of this time. It wasn't just people being naive and falling for propaganda. There were people who saw the danger and fought back, even though it was risky. Were there any others?
Oh, yeah. And this one is really inspiring. This woman, Frances Sweeney, she was Irish Catholic and lived in Boston. She decided to go undercover to expose these violent pro-Nazi militias that were attacking Jewish communities.
A woman going undercover to fight Nazis. Wow. What was going on in Boston?
There was this group called the Christian Front. They were like a fascist militia, and they were influenced by this guy, Father Coughlin. He was a priest with a radio show, and he said all sorts of awful things about Jewish people. This Christian Front group, they actually attacked Jewish people in Boston.
That's terrible. That this kind of hate was happening in America.
It is. And Frances Sweeney, she saw the danger and did something. She joined the Christian Front undercover. She got evidence of what they were doing and helped the police catch them.
These unsung heroes are incredible. They show us that even when things are really bad, people can still make a difference. But what about the U.S. government? Did they ever do anything about these pro-Nazi groups?
Yeah, they did. In 1944, they put a bunch of people on trial for working with the Nazis. It was a huge trial with tons of publicity, like 30 defendants, all with their own lawyers, crammed into this hot courtroom in Washington, D.C.
A sedition trial. That sounds like a movie.
It does. It's got everything. Espionage, betrayal politics, the fight for justice.
So what happened? Did they get convicted?
Well, the trial was a mess. It went on for months. It was a total circus. And then the judge died. He couldn't handle the stress.
Wow, that's intense. So what happened to the trial?
It was a mistrial. But that's not the end of the story. The lead prosecutor, John Rodge, he still wanted to see justice done even though the trial was over.
So he kept going on his own.
Kind of. He got permission from the Attorney General to keep investigating. He wanted to find out everything about the Nazi influence operation. He went to Germany after the war, talked to captured Nazi officials, and got tons of documents from the German government.
This guy didn't give up. What did he find?
Really bad stuff. He found proof that those 24 members of Congress we talked about were really getting paid by the Nazis. They were taking money and orders from the German government.
So he had enough to put those congressmen in jail.
He did. But this is where it gets frustrating. President Truman and his attorney general decided to hide the information.
What? Why would they do that? They had a perfect case.
They were scared of what would happen if people found out. Imagine the scandal. It would have made people lose faith in the government.
So they covered it up. They cared more about politics than justice.
It's hard to say for sure, but Maddow thinks this decision to hide the truth was a mistake. Like it sent the message that powerful people could work with the enemy and get away with it.
That's scary. And it makes you wonder how much we still don't know about this part of American history.
It does. And it shows how important it is for the government to be honest. When those in power keep secrets, it makes it easier for bad things to happen.
This has been really eye-opening. We started with that famous picture of the flag at Iwo Jima, but now we see a much more complicated picture, a country where a lot of people actually liked the Nazis. They had a whole propaganda machine. Corrupt politicians were helping them, and in the end, the government covered it all up.
It just goes to show that history is rarely simple, and it's a story that we need to learn from, especially today.
Yeah, it shows that, fighting for democracy is hard. You always have to be paying attention and be ready to defend it, even when it's not easy.
So we can't just assume that democracy will be okay on its own. We have to, actively protect it.
Exactly. Like, we got to be involved in, like, shaping our politics and making sure our leaders are doing the right thing. We got to protect the stuff that keeps us free. We can't just sit back and watch. That sounds like we need to take action. But, like, what can we actually do? Where do we even start?
I think the first thing is to learn about the things that threaten democracy, like what happened in the past and what's happening now. Rachel Maddow's work is a good place to start, but there's tons of stuff out there. Books, articles, documentaries, they talk about how extremist groups operate and how people have been manipulated throughout history and like what are the signs that democracy is in trouble.
So the more we know, the better we can protect it.
Yeah, you can't fight something if you don't know what it is.
Okay, education is important.
Okay.
What else?
We got to be smarter about the information we take in. We're just flooded with news and opinions these days, especially on social media. It's easy to get caught up in like the latest headlines or whatever's trending. So we need to think critically about things, question what we believe, look at things from different angles.
So we can't just believe everything we see on social media or even what our favorite news channels say.
Right. We got to be skeptical, check our sources, and be willing to admit when we might be wrong. That's what a good citizen does.
That's good advice. What else can we do to protect democracy?
Talk to people who have different opinions than you. Democracy works best when people can debate and share ideas. It's about finding things we agree on even when we see things differently. It's about understanding that people who don't agree with us aren't necessarily bad people.
That's tough, though, especially now when everyone's so divided.
It is. But it's important if we want to stop extremism from getting worse. We got to listen to each other, find common ground, and work together. Otherwise, we're just yelling at each other and nothing gets fixed.
You're right. We need to stop yelling and actually talk to each other. What else can we do?
Support groups that are fighting for democracy and getting people involved in their communities. There are a lot of groups out there, local and national. They're trying to stop people from being prevented from voting. They're teaching people how to be smart about the media. They're pushing for changes that make democracy stronger. We can volunteer, donate to campaigns, or just tell people about them.
It's like put our money where our mouth is.
Exactly. Even small things can help. Every phone call to a politician, every letter to a newspaper, every conversation with a friend or family member can make people more involved and aware.
Those are all good ideas, but it can feel overwhelming sometimes. Like, how do we keep going and not get burnt out when it feels like there's so much to do?
That's a good point. We have to remember that protecting democracy is a long-term thing. It's not going to happen overnight. There will be times when we lose, or when it feels like we're not making progress.
It can feel like you're swimming against the tide sometimes, like you're surrounded by negativity and lies.
Definitely. And that's why it's important to focus on the big picture and appreciate the small wins along the way. Like find those little bits of hope and hold on to them.
So, like, don't try to do everything at once and find ways to enjoy the process. That's good advice in general.
It is. And think about the people who fought for democracy in the past, like Leon Lewis, Henry Hoke, Francis Sweeney. They faced huge obstacles, but they never gave up. They show us that anyone can make a difference.
They were really brave.
They were. And their stories remind us that protecting democracy isn't just something we have to do. It's an honor. We get to help shape the future of our country and make the world a better place. We just got to be willing to step up and do it.
I love that. Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier. The appeal of extremist ideas. We talked about the people in the pro-Nazi movement, but I'm curious about the ideas themselves. Like, what was it about the Nazis that some Americans liked? What did it offer them?
That's a key question. It gets to like the core of how extremism works. The Nazis basically offered this mix of nationalism, authoritarianism, and scapegoating. It appealed to people who were unhappy with how things were, who were scared of change, and who wanted simple answers to complicated problems.
So as a way to like make sense of a world that was confusing and scary.
Right. The Nazis gave people a simple story, a sense of belonging, and a promise of a better future. They blamed everything on outsiders and minorities. They said they would make a perfect society with only one race.
That sounds a lot like what we're seeing today.
Yeah.
Like people being scared of immigration and economic problems and social change.
Yeah, it is. And it shows how important it is to be careful about what we believe and who's telling us those stories.
Okay, so we have the nationalism, the authoritarianism, the scapegoating. What else did the Nazis offer that Americans liked?
They promised economic security and prosperity. You know, the Nazi regime was awful, but in the beginning, they actually did pretty well with the economy. Like, they had big public works projects and they were building up their military.
So they actually got stuff done, at least for a while.
Yeah. And their propaganda was really good at showing off their successes, so people didn't see the bad stuff as much.
It's like even really bad ideas can become popular if they give people what they want.
That's true.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to fight economic inequality and make sure everyone has a chance to succeed.
Okay, so nationalism, authoritarianism, scapegoating, economic security, anything else?
Oh, yeah. They were also anti-intellectual. They didn't trust smart people or academics or anyone who questioned them.
So they didn't like logic or critical thinking.
Nope. They wanted to control what people thought and heard. They didn't want people to disagree. And they used emotions and propaganda instead of facts.
We're seeing that today, too, like with all the conspiracy theories and people not trusting science or experts.
Yeah, that's right. And it's dangerous because it stops us from solving problems and making smart decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. The history of the pro-Nazi movement in America, how it's similar to extremism today and what we can do about it. We also talked about why some Americans liked the Nazis, which helps us understand how extremism works.
Yeah, it's been a good conversation. We covered a lot of complicated stuff and made some connections to what's happening now.
I agree. And I want to keep talking about this in the last part of our deep dive. We'll finish up and talk about the big takeaways from this forgotten part of American history.
It's important to remember that democracy is fragile. We all have to do our part to protect it.
Well said. And on that note, we'll see you in part 3, where we'll talk about what we can learn from the past and how to use those lessons to deal with the problems we face today. Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
In the last 2 parts, we talked about something pretty disturbing, like how many people in America were pro-Nazi back in the 1930s and 40s. And it wasn't just like a few random people. It was like a whole thing with propaganda and politicians and even a cover-up by the government. But now I want to talk about like what we can learn from all this. Like how can this crazy story help us deal with the problems we have today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like the biggest lesson is that democracy is not something you can just ignore. Like it takes work. It takes people being involved and paying attention and being willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
So we can't just like assume that everything will be fine. Like we have to actually do something to protect democracy.
Exactly. We got to be the ones shaping our own politics and making sure our leaders are doing their jobs right.
Yeah.
We got to protect the things that keep us free. We can't just be passive.
So like what can we actually do? Where do we start?
Well, we got to educate ourselves, like learn about the stuff that threatens democracy, both back then and now. Rachel Maddow's work is a good place to start. But there's tons of stuff out there. Books, articles, documentaries. They talk about how these extremist groups work and how they've manipulated people throughout history. And like, what are the signs that democracy is in trouble?
So the more we know, the better prepared we are.
Exactly. You can't fight something if you don't know what it is.
Okay, education is important. What else?
We got to be careful about the information we consume. You know, we're constantly bombarded with news and opinions, especially online. It's easy to just believe whatever we see or hear, especially on social media. So we got to think critically about things.
You mean like not just accepting everything we see on social media or even the news?
Exactly. We got to be skeptical and check our sources. And we got to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong. You know, a good citizen is a skeptical citizen.
That's good advice. What else can we do to protect our democracy?
Talk to people who disagree with you. You know, democracy is all about debate and sharing different ideas. It's about finding common ground even when we see things differently. It's about understanding that just because someone has a different opinion, it doesn't make them a bad person.
That's tough, though. Especially nowadays when everyone's fighting all the time.
It is. But it's important if we want to stop extremism from taking over. We had to listen to each other, find things we agree on, and work together to fix problems. Otherwise, we're just going to keep yelling at each other and nothing will ever change.
Yeah, we got to stop yelling and start talking. What else can we do?
We can support organizations that are working to protect democracy and get people involved in their communities. There are tons of groups out there, both local and national. They're trying to stop people from being blocked from voting. They're teaching people how to be smart about the media. They're pushing for changes that make democracy stronger. We can volunteer our time, donate to their campaigns, or just tell people about them.
So like put our money where our mouth is.
Exactly. Even small things can make a difference. Every phone call to a politician, every letter to a newspaper, every conversation with a friend or family member can help create a more informed and active citizenry.
Those are all great ideas. But sometimes it feels overwhelming. Like, how do we keep going and not burn out when there's so much to do?
That's a good question. It's important to remember that defending democracy is a long-term thing. It's not going to happen overnight. We're going to have setbacks and disappointments and times when it feels like we're not making any progress.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like you're fighting a losing battle. Like all you see is negativity and lies.
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to focus on the big picture and celebrate the small wins along the way. Like, find those little bits of hope and hold on to them.
So like, don't try to do everything at once and find ways to enjoy the process. That's good advice for just about anything.
It is. And think about the people who fought for democracy in the past, like Leon Lewis, Henry Hoke, Francis Sweeney. They faced incredible challenges, but they never gave up. They show us that anyone can make a difference.
Yeah, they were really brave.
They were. And they remind us that protecting democracy isn't just a duty, it's an honor. We get to help shape the future of our country and the world. We get to make things more just and fair and free. We just got to be willing to do the work.
That's a great way to put it. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening and honestly a little scary. We've uncovered this hidden history that most people don't even know about, like a time when fascism almost took root in America. But we've also talked about what we can learn from this history and how to use those lessons to deal with the problems we face today.
Yeah, it's a reminder that democracy is fragile, and we all have to be vigilant and stay involved. It's not something we can just take for granted.
Well said. And on that note, we want to leave you with this final thought. Democracy is not a destination, it's a journey. And it's a journey that requires all of us to be active participants. So keep learning, keep engaging, and keep fighting for the things that matter most. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.